So we're going to get started in just a few moments. First, I'm going to give kind of an overview of what Acast is, what Aclass is, and why we're running this workshop. I also want to, before we get started, we'll see Trace is here. Trace is going to be our lovely questions manager. He also sits on the content team, as do I at Acast. He's amazing. So say hello, Trace.
Hi. Yeah, if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and I will answer them and pop into Becky and help Becky throughout the time. So any questions you have, just shoot them in there. I'll get to them.
So what is Acast? So Acast, for those of you who may not know, is a hosting, distribution, and monetization platform, which basically means, we provide the back end where you can upload episodes and then they get kind of sent to Apple and Spotify and things like that. We also help shows monetize. So, those two things are really the main things. Aclass is our series of workshops aimed at people from diverse communities. And we've run previous events for we have Acast Black, Acast Queer Voices, Aclass Latinx Voices, and our goal with Aclass is to create a pipeline of diverse creators who all have the tools that they need to kind of make podcasts and feel empowered to do that. And then who am I? So my name is Becky and I work at Acast. I currently sit on the content team. And sorry, I'm like checking the chat. We're not going to go through ILOC. I'll send through after this like a step-by-step, just because it's sort of complicated, and I think with screenshots it'll make much more sense. So we won't go through the ILOC stuff today, but again, this will be recorded and you can watch after. So anyway, so who am I? I'm Becky. I used to be a producer. I'm obsessed with Pro Tools, and I have had a lot of access to people who've been very generous with teaching me this program. So really a lot of what I learned from Pro Tools is from experts. So audiobook producers, podcast producers, TV audio producers. So there was a recent article in The Verge that surrounded Pro Tools being a huge piece, a huge kind of gatekeeping tactic for a huge gatekeeping tactic for people in diverse communities because it's so cost prohibitive. And that really upset me. And also there have been a lot of conversations by men in this industry who, say that women don't know how to use Pro Tools, and that really offends me. So I'm running this workshop to give a really basic one-on-one of the program so people feel empowered to start using it. So again, the goal of this session is not to be an expert in Pro Tools. It's to give you kind of an overview of what to expect when you open the program. And this is not going to be an expert course. We're not going to talk crazy engineering things. We're really going to cover the basics. And the ultimate goal for me is, if you see a job that says it requires Pro Tools experience, that you'll be able to apply for that job. Or if you want to edit your current podcast or your, potential podcast in Pro Tools, you will feel empowered to do that. So again, we'll get a basic lay of the land. We'll talk about the most critical tools and some really useful shortcuts. We'll also talk about importing audio, kind of the very basics of laying out your track. We'll talk about exporting your audio so that you can use it in places, post your podcast somewhere. One of the things I mentioned this, a bit before, we'll not be talking about how to download the program. That could take a literal hour. So after this, I'll be sure to send through like a screenshot by screenshot 101 on how to do that. I know that might be frustrating if you are planning on following along. Again, this will be recorded and you can always shoot me an email after. As I mentioned earlier, Trace will be answering questions. So if you have questions, I may not see them. He'll shout them out. He's going to kind of group them together. So just hold tight if they're not answered. And we'll take a few minutes at the end to answer any outstanding ones. And the last thing I want to mention before we dive into the program is that I'm on a Mac. So some of the keystrokes and some of the shortcuts I'm using may be different if you're on a Windows. I haven't used a Windows in years. So, just, if you know what the option key is on the window, it's the same thing. So just keep that in mind. And with that, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get rocking and rolling. Okay, Cool. Can everyone, Trace, if you can give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, hopefully that means everyone else can. Cool.
Yep.
Alrighty. So once you get the program kind of all set up, again, I will send over instructions after. I realize that might be frustrating. You're going to open the program by hitting a beautiful little mark at the bottom of your screen. It looks like this, and it says Pro Tools First. Pro Tools First is a pared down version of Pro Tools. There are some differences between Pro Tools, like the real Pro Tools and Pro Tools First, but all the essentials we're covered today are exactly the same in this program as they are in the paid version. So if you know how to edit here, you'll be able to edit anywhere. What opens is going to be this screen prompting you to create or open a session. What you're naming here and what you're creating here is just the place where you're going to edit. This isn't going to be the name of your file, or doesn't have to be the name of the file you export. This is just the screen to create. There's also some templates here. I never create with a template because most of these are based in music, as you can see. So you can just kind of type a name, hello, and then it should prompt you to create one. But we are not going to create one because I have one already. So we're going to open this session, and what you're going to see as we open, your session when you first open one will not look like this. For the sake of this training, I added a few things that we'll talk through just to keep it simple. Your session will be sort of blank, and we'll talk about how to add the things that you're seeing here. So first, this window you're looking at is called the edit window. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my screen. This window you're seeing is called the edit window. There's also another window in Pro Tools. It's called the mix window. In order to see that, you can either go window mix, or you can do what I do, which is Command $, and it'll appear. Talk about the differences and when you're going to use both of these windows. But if someone is saying, open the mix window, open the edit window, this is what they're talking about. You're also seeing right now, you're seeing some tracks, which are these gray sections that move left to right. And you're seeing some clips on these tracks. So any of these are what we call clips. Some of this vernacular is exactly the same in other programs. Some of it is not. So this seems super basic. We're really trying to keep this inclusive for people who may not already know how to edit. We're first going to start with this toolbar at the top and go through what each of these things do and when you're going to use them. So the first thing on this list is a square. When we get to editing, we're going to talk in detail about when these are used, but just know these are essentially modes of editing. That seems very vague now. We'll get to it, I promise. The next thing, in arguably one of the most important pieces of Pro Tools, is this. So this you can really think of as a toolbox for how to use the program. So we'll go through each of these tools one by one. So the first you'll see is magnifying glass. If I click the magnifying glass, it highlights. And then if I click on my session, it makes things bigger. Pretty self-explanatory. If you've used any program in 2020, there's probably a magnifying glass. The one thing I want to mention here, and this is a shortcut that I want to bring up that I use frequently or have used frequently, is that if you want to zoom in and out, it'd be really annoying to have to click back and forth to zoom. So you can actually hit Option and scroll it up and down. So that can either be on a trackpad or it can be on a mouse. If you just hold Option and scroll, it will make things bigger and smaller for you. So I think that is really useful. I'll be mentioning a lot of shortcuts throughout this. When I learned Pro Tools, I had a teacher who made, it was in college, a teacher who made us make a list of all the shortcuts. And that was a list I referred to religiously. So that might be something that's helpful to keep a list of some of the shortcuts that I'm mentioning. The next tool over is this, trim tool. So let's say you want to take a clip. Again, this is a clip, and you want to shrink it. You want to cut off the beginning, you want to cut off the end. By clicking the trim tool, when you bring your cursor to a clip, it'll form a little bracket. And that bracket allows you to, you guessed it, trim. So if I click and drag, the file trims. So really you're going to use this anytime you want to cut off the beginning or ends of files. But let's say you don't want to cut off the beginning of it or ends of files. Well, there's another tool for that. and it's the tool right next to the trim tool, and it's called the Selector. So the Selector tool allows you to select clips, select pieces of clips, and then cut them. So let's say we wanted to cut, this piece of audio. We could select it with the Selector tool. When we scroll over it, it's a little cursor, and you can hit delete. So I've selected that and I've deleted it. So that's really useful when you want a huge section of clips out, or you want a piece of something out. You can select it and delete it. The next tool over is this little hand tool, and the hand tool is called the grabber. And the grabber allows you to grab clips and move them. So that can be back and forth. That can be between tracks. Again, these kind of bars left to right are called tracks. So I can move this clip up here. So the hand tool allows you to move things. I'm just being sure. Okay. The thing that's cool about Pro Tools, and I think is part of the reason that it's my favorite audio editing program, is what's called the multi-tool. So as we click through, right, you can see that these tools up at the top highlight blue. But if I click this kind of bar over these three main tools, all three light up. So this is called the multi-tool, and it combines all three tools into one, depending on where your cursor is on a clip. So remember before, if we were on the bracket tool, it stayed a bracket regardless of where I was on the clip. When I hit this multi-tool, depending on where I am on the clip, my tool changes. So as you can see in the top half of this clip, I have a little cursor. And if I cross over the midline, it turns into a hand. So let's say I want to highlight here, I want to delete this, and then I want to move these. I can do all that without having to switch the tools that I'm using. It also allows you to trim your clips the same way that we did before, as long as you bring your cursor to the edge of a clip. So really, depending on the placement of your cursor on the clip, it'll adjust what tool is available. There's also this little pencil tool. We're not going to talk about that today. It's used for things like volume automation. So it's just not something that a one-on-one person is really going to need to use. And we're also not going to talk about these tools down here. Whatever settings you're set at are likely going to be good for what you need to do. So I wouldn't really worry too much about those. So I'm just going to pause and just take a peek at the questions. Let's see, does Pro Tools allow editing keyboard shortcuts? So they don't allow editing keyboard shortcuts. So this one, if you just got to learn the new shortcuts, it sucks. And then in the chat, anyone's trace in the chat that I think would be useful?
Yeah, Francesca asked a question that I know you touch on later, so I won't get to that. I'll let you get there. But yeah, there's some external options in terms of adding like other programs that allow you to change the shortcuts, but Pro Tools doesn't have it natively.
Cool, so we're good? Keep moving? Cool. Okay, so we've covered this little toolbox, and we'll look at these more in context when we start importing our own audio and start playing with what we're seeing here. So we're just going to move to the next section over. This is just a timestamp, so it's telling you where your clips or where your cursor. So as you can see, if I click, we get this blinking line, and this is changing, this timestamp up at the top. So it's just telling you where your cursor is. But if you click a clip and look over here, it gives you some interesting information. So it's telling you at what timestamp your clip starts, at what timestamp your clip ends, and the length of the clip. So this is useful, let's say you only want to have 8 seconds of a clip, and this clip is now 18 seconds, and I wanted to cut it down to 8 seconds. I can do that and look up here to make it really exact. For podcast editing, I would say 9 times out of 10, something being 100% exact doesn't matter. But if it does, and if that is something you're interested in, this information up here is very useful. Now, the tools you're seeing next to this, we're not going to touch on. Pro Tools is a program that's designed for music people. And that was, musicians are using this program to create, some of the tracks you're hearing on the radio. For podcast people, and in the context of what we're trying to get through today, we don't need to ignore it. don't worry about it. It's my suggestion to you. The next thing over here is just going to be a stop, play, and record button. I'm going to flag this right now. We're not going to talk about recording into Pro Tools. I could spend another 3 hours talking about the different setups to get that to work. We're just not going to touch on it. So instead, you have a stop button and a play button. So if we hit play, it'll play. Oh, you're hearing my sheep. It's amazing. And if I hit stop, it will stop. Very self-explanatory. You can also do this by hitting the space bar, and that will do the same thing. As you see, my cursor is moving, and you're hearing my lovely sheep. Cool. So the next thing we're going to look at are the tracks. So the first thing that's important with a track is obviously, how do you get a track? How do you make a track? There's 2 ways to do that. You can go track up at the top and hit new, or you can do what I always do, which is Command Shift N, and this lovely little prompt will open. It's going to give you a few options for your track. You can make it, how many tracks do you want to make? Do you want them in stereo or mono? What type of track? Where do you want your track? So for this, I would say, if you're unsure, can just keep it how it is, and you can adjust things later. Or there's another way, if you're not sure if your clip is a stereo or a mono clip, there's another way to make a track that we'll get to in just a moment. And for this kind of audio tracks drop down, for everything you're going to need for podcasting as a beginner, just keep it in audio tracks. So we're going to hit create, and we're going to create a new mono track, which, as you can see, appears. And we're going to make this one big so you can see it. I'm making these bigger and smaller by just putting my cursor on the bottom of the track and dragging. So not rocket science, but something that took me a long time to figure out how to do, which is a little sad. So on your track, as you can see, the tracks that were existing look a little different than the track that we've created. There's going to be 2 things I'm going to ask you to do. Normally, I like to give a reason why you should do something. I don't know why you should do these things. I just know that if you don't, things sound weird. So take that with what you will. The first is going to be this little polyphonic call out. Your Pro Tools first, when you download it, it may not automatically do this. I don't know why mine does. Again, you always learn every day with Pro Tools how to do things. So you're going to hit this kind of triangle. I'm not sure how big it is on your screens, but right next to the word polyphonic on the left, there's a little button, and you're just going to disable elastic audio. Again, I'm not exactly sure what it does, and if there's an engineer on the call who wants to say that, you can put it in the chat. I'm not sure what it does. I've never used it, and it's always off when I use Pro Tools. And the other thing, which this is sort of a small thing that's just a housekeeping item, I usually hit this little metronome button, and I set it to samples. Ticks is, from my understanding, used for more music-focused audio editing. I always have edited with it in samples. It might not make a difference. And again, I'm not really sure. I'm not a super huge expert in Pro Tools. I just know all the basics enough to hopefully help y'all. So now that we have a track, we can drag some audio onto this track. So that's actually, hold on. Sorry. Before we get to that, we're going to talk about these symbols on the track. So each of the tracks has this same set of symbols, and essentially they affect the audio on that specific track. So the first 2 buttons, this little round dot and the little I, those are both related to when you want to record into Pro Tools. So we're not going to talk about them. Just don't click them. If you click them, nothing bad will happen. Just unclick them. You just don't need them for basic editing. The next 2 are super vital. They're the solo and the mute buttons. So let's say you're editing, right? And I start, I'm actually going to drag this. I start playing here. Music, and you hear my sheep, right? But I only want to hear the sheep. I don't want to hear the music, even though it's a jam. I just want to hear my sheep. So in that case, you're going to go to this track, right? Because the sheep are living on the SFX track, the sound effects track. You're going to hit this little S for solo. And when I hit play, we're only hearing the sheep. Oh my God, we love those sheep. So that's what that track does, okay? When we only have 2 tracks, soloing, you can kind of solo in 2 ways, but let's say we had another piece of audio, we would need something maybe like a mute button. So let's say you don't want to solo this track, but you do want to mute the music. So let's say you're editing, you have a bunch of layers of files. If when you solo something, only that track will play. Even if you have 50 tracks, if you solo it, only that track will play. But let's say you just want one track to not play, you're gonna hit the mute button, which is right next to the solo button. Turns orange. If I hit play, we're still only gonna hear the sheep, but Daft Punk will be muted instead of the sheep being soloed. Sort of a small difference. And we're gonna get to adding some audio on these tracks, which I think will make this a bit clearer. So I have on my desktop a folder of audio. Let's see, I wonder if this one. So this is actually a good example. So right now, this track is what we call a mono track. A mono track means that the audio is coming from one point evenly to both of your ears. There isn't a split. So instead of things, having a left track and a right track, it only comes from one direction in terms of sound. A stereo track may have differences in the left and the right. This may seem like sort of an over explanation, but I bring this up, right? Because when we created this track, we created a mono track. How can we tell? If you look very closely, and it may not be hugely visible, this track has a line running down the center. And we also see that there's two channels on this track, right? We see two basically the same waveforms of audio. A mono track would only have one waveform of audio. And this comes up because I'm trying to drag this file into Pro Tools, and it's not letting me put it on this track because this file is also a stereo file. So what we're going to do in that case, and this is the second way that I mentioned that you can create a track, is if you take your MP3, you can just drag it, pop it at the bottom, and it'll appear, and it'll automatically put it on a new track. So again, you're going to have to turn off your polyphonic audio, put this in samples, but it will create a nice new track for you. So just give me 1 second. Okay, so that sort of nicely leads us into how to import audio. One way, right, is that we drag and drop from a file. You can also do a really simple way, which is import, and my computer will load. And we're gonna add some clapping. And that will automatically put whatever clip you import onto its own track, and it'll also put that clip right at the start of your session, which is what this program is, or what you're seeing. It's a session. So we don't want this at the beginning of our track. We want it with the rest of our audio. So we're going to use the hand tool. We're going to drag it all the way over, and maybe we'll zoom out. So we're going to hit Option, and we're going to scroll down. It'll zoom out, and we're going to keep dragging. So now we have sort of a nice collection of clips. I'm just going to take a moment to do this. And this empty mono track, we don't need it, right? We don't have any mono files, so we're going to delete this. Super easy to do that. You're going to right click, and you're going to hit delete. All right, so just being sure I covered everything. Cool. So before we get into kind of the basics of editing and some things you should take note of as you're editing, are there any questions, Trace, that I should address? Anything?
Yeah, one question that people are asking is if this is destructive or non-destructive.
So this is, Pro Tools can do destructive editing. I have it set so it doesn't do destructive editing. You can control that. I believe there's like a preferences. In the real Pro Tools, there's like a preferences pane. I'm not actually sure where in Pro Tools first you can control that. So I would assume, because it's not giving me the option, that it's all non-destructive and it's all making copies, because these are files I've edited before. But I can actually follow up with that in the email with how to download. I'm 90% sure that it's non-destructive, but I don't want to have people ruining the files. If you're worried, make a copy of your files and use those in Pro Tools. Again, I don't think it's destructive.
Great. And then one other question is, can you change a track already done in mono to stereo and vice versa?
So you can change a stereo track to 2 monos, but you can't change a mono track to a stereo track. For Pro Tools, that's sort of I would almost think of the way Pro Tools deals with tracks is in very strict terms. So once a track is created, that is the track. And unless you delete it, you can't change the fundamental piece of it. Just like if I wanted, there's a few things that you can't undo in Pro Tools, and say undeleting a track is one of them. So, I deleted that mono track before. I can't just Command Z and bring that track back. It won't work. So that actually is a really good thing to be aware of. If you're worried or you're unsure if you want to delete a track, you just don't want it to play or appear, there's a way to do that. In this tracks pane, if you right-click any of the tracks, you can hide and make inactive. This will remove the track from your view. It won't play, but it won't delete the track. So if you're ever, I can delete the mono track because there's nothing on it. I know it's blank, but if you're a little worried, just hide and make inactive. That might be the best bet. Cool. Anything else?
Okay, and last quick question. Someone asked, when would you use mono versus stereo?
So because this is a beginner's course, I'm going to say that your distinction between mono and stereo is likely only going to come into play depending on what your recorder is spitting out to you. So if you use, a Zoom recorder and you have, here's actually a good example. So I don't know if you're familiar with Zoom recorders. There's some of them have like little inputs on them, and each of those represents one channel. So you have a left channel or a right channel or a single mono channel. Maybe actually this may be way more confusing than it needs to be. So I'm going to shelve that because I'm realizing people may not know what a Zoom is. So to keep it really simple, don't worry about the difference between mono and stereo. If you're unsure what your track is or what your clip is, just drag it into the bottom so you don't have to worry about it. It's from an engineer's perspective, and if there's any engineers on this line, I apologize for butchering this, but for a beginner, I wouldn't worry about it. If you're not sure, you can just pop it on the bottom and create a new track that way. Yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I don't want people to get more confused than this is already. Cool?
That's it.
Cool. All right, so now we have this beautiful layout of tracks. So what do we do with this, right? Like we don't want this to just be a collection of random sounds. We want this to sound like something. So I'm gonna kind of talk you through what I would do with this audio. So, I know I want to start with some music. I want my music to start and build. So I'm gonna sort of move my music so that there's really nothing underneath it at the front. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do. Then I'm gonna zoom in. Again, I'm gonna hold Option and scroll in. I zoomed in a little too much, so I'm gonna zoom a bit out. And I'm gonna say, I can see in the in what's called the waveform, that's these little zigzaggy lines. I can see in this waveform that it's pretty quiet at the top. So I don't really need like, how many seconds of silence is this? I don't need 14 seconds of silence. I wanna really get to the meat a bit quicker. So I'm gonna trim my clip. I'm gonna bring my cursor to the edge. I'm gonna drag it. We're gonna put it here, right? So there, oh no, Trace has disappeared. I wonder if he's still there. Oh, he's still there. I think he just turned his video off. You're good, sorry. So I trimmed my clip, again, by bringing my cursor to the edge. And now when I start playing, we're gonna hear some music. We're jamming. You see how when I started this, it sort of started abruptly, right? Just started out of nowhere. For some people that may work, but for what I want to do, I don't want that. I want it to still have a bit of that fade in, but I don't want to have kept it from the original audio. So one cool tool that you can use while editing, if you bring your mouse up to the corner of a clip, a little square appears. I'm not sure how apparent this is, but there is a little square there. If I click and hold, it'll create a fade. So you can fade things in. So let's hear the difference there. Okay, so it's gradually getting a little louder. We're gradually building our jam session, right? Beautiful depth, R&B forever. So we really like that. So we're gonna keep it. Maybe we're gonna shorten this a little bit. We don't want that much of a fade. So now I know that I want to have the music, through my sheep sounds, but I don't need this much music, right? The music is so long. I want to keep this like really short, really sweet. So we're gonna drag from the edge of this, and we're gonna trim it all the way down, right? So that's one way we can do this. Or I'm gonna Command Z. We can create a cut or an edit. And the key shortcut for that is Command E, and it will cut wherever your cursor is. So right now my cursor is at about, I think it's 5:30. Wow, I'm blind. And you're gonna hit Command E, and you'll see that it's split this clip wherever the cursor is. So I can keep clicking around, keep cutting things, using clips where I want them. But for this, I just wanted to delete the tail end of this clip. So I've cut it. I'm now selecting it with my hand tool, and I'm gonna hit the delete button. Ta-da, it disappears. And now the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drag, I want my sheep to be a bit closer so I can get a bit exact. So we're gonna drag my sheep sound effects up, and we're gonna say that the sheep start right as the fade ends. So if we play this now, the music is still so loud. I don't really want the music to be that loud. I really want to hear the pristine sheep. I hope you guys appreciate this clip because I am getting a kick out of the sheep sound effects, but that's just me. So we're gonna control volume. So again, if there's any engineers in the call, which there probably aren't, there's a big difference between gain and volume. This is a beginner's course, so we're just going to talk about volume and think of volume in the traditional sense. You turn a knob up, the volume gets louder, turn a knob down, volume gets quieter. The same thing is, used in Pro Tools. So the way we're going to do this is that we're going to go to this track, because this clip is living on the track. And there's a little tiny arrow it's very easy to miss. So we're gonna click this arrow, and a little pane is gonna appear, and it's gonna be labeled volume. So we're gonna mess with what's called the volume automation. And volume automation just means that Pro Tools will automatically raise and lower the volume depending on what you tell it. So the way we work with volume automation is you're gonna hit the command button as you hover over this line, and you're gonna see a little hand appears, and you're gonna click, and you can create points along this line. So for now, we're just gonna create 2, and if I drag this point down, it's going to lower the volume for this section of clip. So the same way that we faded in this clip, this is sort of like an in the middle of a clip fade. So we're gonna hit play. Music, instead of hear the sheep much better. So we're also gonna add another track here, and that's gonna be our friend Trace. It's gonna be some audio that he recorded for me. Oh, and this is, you see this is a mono track. So when I dragged it in, it only has sort of one waveform versus having 2, as you can see with some of these other clips. So after the sheep end, we want to have Trace start talking. So we've lowered our volume. We have another point that has appeared over here. Sometimes volume automation gets messy if you move clips around. So just be aware of that. And be sure you're checking your volume automation if something is sounding a bit weird. So right now, we only want to hear the Trace track. We only want to hear what he's saying. And so we're going to make his track a little bigger. We're going to make the music a little smaller. And then we're going to hit the solo button. So we can only hear Trace's track. We won't hear anything else play. So Trace, prepare to hear yourself.
What's new in podcasting?
What is new?
Here's what we love, courtesy of Acast recommends.
Tracy's such a trooper.
What's new in
I had him record like a zillion takes of the same thing. But we don't need to use a zillion takes of the same thing. We only want to use one of the takes. So we can sort of see in this waveform, it's actually easier to see here. There's like 3 different groupings of clips, or 3 different groupings of kind of audio. And then there's a big pause, and then there's more little groupings. So let's say, I know that this take, the second take, is the best take. So I want to just take that take. I don't want to have to worry about anything else. I just want that take. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this section, and I'm going to use our friendly trim or cut tool, slice. I don't remember what the actual tool is called, but it's the Command E, right? So that actually, now that it's highlighted, it creates 3 different tracks. Technically, we have before, the track that we want, or the clip that we want, and after. So we know that we want this clip, so we're going to delete everything before, we're going to delete everything after, and we're going to place this right as the sheep start. So listen to this. But we can't hear it, right? Because the track is soloed. Even seasoned professionals forget about a solo. So we're going to hit play now. Now that things are
What's new in podcasting? Here's what we love.
Like the music is still a bit loud. So we're going to add, we're going to drag this point down even further.
What's new in podcasting?
There we go.
Here's what we love,
Okay,
courtesy of
balance.
Acast recommends.
Now,
quick question. A couple people are asking about, sorry, real quick. A couple people are asking about that volume line.
Yes.
And if that volume line there is only affecting the music versus like the audio, me speaking, and if there's like lines that affect the whole thing, and how you make it so that volume line only affects that one track.
So each track has this little arrow, and each track has its own volume line. So you see here, I've kind of expanded all of the volume lines. It's always going to be the one underneath it. So you can adjust, I can adjust the volume on trace, I can add some points, drag things down. I can also select and delete these volume points. And now, for now, we're just going to collapse all of these to keep it easy to visualize. But yes, there is also a volume line for the whole session. Now, this volume line exists on its own track called the master track. Now, how do you create a master track? You're going to do the same process to create a normal track. Again, that's Command-Shift-N. This will appear, and you're going to select, instead of audio track, you're going to select master fader. So master fader controls everything. It's the boss, it's the master, it controls everything. I'm not going to create one now just because I already have one, but this is what you'll do. I'll select it. I usually make my master faders in stereo. There's a lot of reasoning for that I think would be confusing to get into for the beginners here. I recommend making your faders in stereo. So again, you would hit create and that would appear. We already have one, so we're not going to hit that. So if this line functions the same way. I can drag the volume down on the whole project. I can drag the volume up on the whole project.
Comments.
Ooh. I can also create points in the same way I did on the other tracks. And this volume would affect everything. It wouldn't just affect, one track. So this is something to keep in mind. If you're having like weird volume issues, check your master fader. There's also another way to do this that I'm only really going to touch upon quickly, but that lives within our mix window. So right now we're looking at our edit window. We know because it says edit up at the top. But in our mix window, which we got by hitting Command =, or by going to Window Mix, this gives you, it creates a virtual board. So when you see a DJ and they have like the sliders and they're like jamming with their headphones, moving things up and down, this is essentially a virtual one of those, and each of your tracks has a slider. So you also have a master fader here that you can drag up and down, and it'll affect, as you can see in the background. So take a look over here. As I drag this up and down, it also affects that same line. So when you're dealing with volume on the edit window, people refer to it frequently as volume automation. And if you're dealing with it on the mix window, it's really, I think there's probably a term for it. I just call it like dragging the slider or dragging the faders up and down. So again, there might be engineers here who are watching me butcher this, but you know, that's really the difference is, people consider this automation because you can automate, you know, how the computer deals with volume versus just fading it up and down. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Yeah, 2 other follow-up questions. Someone asked, do you recommend creating a master fader for every session? And what is like the practical use? What do you want session need to use the master fader for?
So I always create a master fader for any session. The people, this is sort of a crude example, but a lot of people talk about Pro Tools as if like a euphemism for using Pro Tools is it's like having sex because everyone does it differently. And so I'm going to talk about how I use a master fader. There might be people who use it very differently. I always create a master fader because it allows me to master the tracks so they sound equal. So that can be things like compressing or EQing tracks overall. We're not going to get into compression and EQ because I think they're very complicated that we could spend a whole other session on. But I always create a master fader so I have control not just of each individual output, but of the overall output of any session I'm working on. So that could be, you know, volume, that could be some more complicated things. But it is useful to be able to control overall levels. So let's say you've exported this and the whole thing is too quiet. Instead of going in and having to manually raise every single track or every single clip and every single track, you just drag this fader up and down. So yes, I would recommend creating a master fader in every session you use and, you know, use it to control everything. Cool. Anything else on that front? Cool. Okay, so now we're going to get into something that Trace can attest. It's confusing to explain, and please ask questions on this piece because it's very important to how Pro Tools functions, but is different than a lot of other, okay, I'm just going to get into it, and if you're confused, throw questions in. So remember at the top, we talked about this little square, and we had our shuffle, we had slip, and we had spot and grid. So what I'm going to tell you off the bat is that grid is mainly used in music settings, so don't worry about it. Now, these 3 buttons are essentially modes of editing. So they affect how clips interact as you're editing. So spot, I use very rarely. It is a useful thing to know about, so we're going to briefly touch upon it. If I am on spot mode and I click any clip, a dialog will come up and it'll ask me to place it at a certain timestamp. So I would use this personally if I wanted to shift an entire session to say 1 hour in or a half hour in into a session. I rarely use this. It's useful to know, but I wouldn't worry about it too much if you're not getting it. Now, shuffle and slip are, in my opinion, the most important things to understand about Pro Tools. So we've been in slip this whole time. Slip is very self-explanatory. If I move a clip, it slips. It moves freely within a session without any parameters. Shuffle, on the other hand, we're just going back. Shuffle, on the other hand, forces the clips to always snap back together. So if we look at this example of Trace's audio, if I zoom in, again, option scroll up. So I'm in shuffle mode now. If I bring my cursor and want to trim, say, this clip, I maybe only want the end of this clip and only want the end of this clip and only want the beginning of this clip. If I interact with this, so watch what happens. If I drag this and just get the beginning, it automatically snaps the clips back together. So again, do it again, snaps the clips back together. Some audio editors do this automatically. That's the only option you have. Some don't. The difference between these 2 modes is something that, or using these 2 modes how do I describe this? If you're editing long form, like a long form interview, and you just want to cut out an instead of having to like snap your clips back together and manually pull them back together, this sort of gives you the freedom to just quickly snaps and quickly edit things out, and it'll snap back together. So basically, it always makes sure that the clips are snapping. And this applies only within the track. So there's no clips after this, but if I dragged here, if there was a clip here, it would automatically do the same thing. Actually, let's do a cool example. So we're gonna drag this, we're gonna go back into Slip, we're gonna drag this clip up to the same track as the sheep, our lovely sheep. We're gonna go back into shuffle mode, and shuffle applies regardless of if there's space. It doesn't have to be clips that are snapping together. If I edited right now, it would always keep the same distance between the tracks, regardless if that is, dead air, or if that is, another clip snapping together. It also lets you, if I'm in shuffle mode and I drag this clip, it'll push it exactly up against the clip before it. So the only options you have in shuffle are to snap a clip to another clip. Slip mode allows you to move clips freely. So that's really the main distinction. Are there any questions on that? I feel like I was so confused when I first learned this. So
someone asked if there's a way to shuffle audio across all tracks.
So say move the whole session into, a certain, I'm assuming this is what you mean. So yes, there is a way to do it. And you're gonna go, remember on our on any track, depending on where your cursor is, if we're gonna start that over again. If you're in the multi-tool, depending on where your cursor is in a track, you change tools. So if I say wanted to make all of these clips move a bit to the left, if I highlight here, right, I only am highlighting these two tracks. If I then hit delete while I'm in shuffle mode, right, there's nothing here to delete. If I hit delete here, it'll move everything. So that can apply. You can highlight what you want to move, or you can highlight whole sections. So let's say you want to move the whole session back. If I select up here on this gray bar, it'll highlight everything. It'll move everything as well if I hit delete. There's also a way to push things, but I always forget the shortcut. Let's see if I can remember it. I think it's this. Yeah, I can't remember the shortcut. So there is a shortcut to, instead of closing everything to the left, push everything to the right. If someone knows it, feel free to throw it in the chat. I am forgetting it, so sorry. Okay, so we've gone over a bunch of stuff. We've gone over slip, shuffle, we've edited tracks, we've highlighted, we've grabbed and moved. So let's say, we have our beautiful session. We're adding a nice little fade over here. We know we just want, say, this section of what Trace is saying. Again, when you're editing, I would recommend listening to these things, but for the sake of this, you don't have to, we're not going to listen to every clip, except our sheep. We're going to listen to a lot of the sheep. So let's say this is what we want, right? This is our beautiful audio session. So right now, if we tried to export this, just as we're seeing it right now, without selecting anything, without doing anything, it would export everything from timestamp 0 to the end of the last clip. So our last clip is, I think, this clapping clip. So it would be this crazy long file, but we don't want it to export everything. We just want this section of what we're seeing. So an important thing, I'm going to stress this so much, an important thing with Pro Tools is that you have to select what you want to export. If you don't select it, it won't export the thing that you wanted to export. So in order to select, we're going to, again, either go to our highlight tool and we can select all the clips. Ooh, sorry, I'm going to keep hitting a different button that we're not going to go over. It's making markers. So you have to select the things that you want to export. You can either select each individual clip. You can select up here, if you hit this gray bar and drag, it'll select everything. The other thing that I want to note, which You don't really have to worry about that much. Sorry, my talking for an hour, my throat is gone. Pro Tools will export. When I export from Pro Tools, I usually just select the longest clip. So this clip, right, spans the distance between all of these. So if I just select this clip, I'm going to get everything from timestamp, 4:33 to timestamp 5 minutes, which includes everything underneath there. So when in doubt, just select everything. As you kind of get good and used to the program, you can just select your longest clip. Anyway, so a long spiel about exporting. Okay, so now you've highlighted what you want to export. If anything is muted or soloed, it will be muted or soloed when you export it. So if you're not hearing something and aren't sure why, check that it is muted, or check if it's muted, or check if it's soloed. Okay, so now that we've gotten over all the things you have to do before, exporting itself is pretty easy. You're gonna go up to File, and you're gonna hit Export. In the real program, it's called bouncing. I wish I knew why. I wish I knew why that was the term. It just is. In Pro Tools First, it's called export. So you're gonna do audio mix, and this little prompt is gonna appear. So I'm gonna give you, if you were someone who wants to take your audio and upload it into a podcast distribution platform like Acast, you're just gonna do MP3. It gives you more options like waves and AIFF. I'm not sure what that is, but if you're uploading this as a podcast, I would just export it as an MP3. It'll also give you an option for how to deal with stereo versus mono. If you're a beginner, keep it on interleaved. Just keep it easy on yourself. So those are really the only settings you're gonna have to worry about. There's just one tiny thing that you need to make sure is checked, and that's this little offline button. This doesn't mean that it's gonna like turn your internet off. It just means that it won't, if you had a 10-minute file and offline wasn't checked, it would take 10 minutes to export it. But in actuality, it would take 2 seconds if you had offline clicked. So offline just means the program doesn't have to listen to everything to export it. So in essence, hit offline. It's strongly recommended, hit offline. Gonna hit export. For MP3s, this field for metadata appears. If you don't know what metadata is, don't worry about it. If you do, you can use this to add some metadata to your file. You're gonna hit OK, and it'll bounce it. And then that file, for me, I had it set to my desktop. You can choose where you want it to export. And you can see, if I play this, for a nice 27-second file, we got some jamming, a sheep, so exporting is just going to export things as they are. So let's say you wanted to make Trace a bit louder, make Trace louder. You can do all sorts of edits. Each export though isn't gonna, you're gonna have to re-export if you make changes. So get used to having lots of versions of things if you're worried about having changes. Okay, so really that is Pro Tools First. Everything we've gone over today is almost exactly the same in the real Pro Tools. I can think of very little that's different. All the shortcuts are the same. All of how everything looks is almost exactly the same. Real Pro Tools has some more like fancy buttons. I would say if you're unsure, just ignore it. Don't worry about it. But really everything you've seen, you're able to do the exact same thing in Real Pro Tools. So I recommend playing around with this program and getting familiar with it, especially if you're someone who wants, say, a career in podcasting or wants to become a producer and you're feeling worried that you don't have experience in Pro Tools. Poke around in Pro Tools first, edit your podcast in Pro Tools first, get used to it. And when the time comes to use Real Pro Tools, you're gonna be totally set. Totally set. Cool. So are there any other questions? I'm imagining cool. I see 88 messages.
I know we're getting close on time, but a few quick questions. Someone is asking about normalizing audio and leveling out different audio tracks and making sure that everything is leveled the same.
So this is a beginner session, so you can adjust volume and make sure things sound the same. There's also, we didn't actually talk about this, but if you hit play, you'll see there's both meters on the tracks and on the session up here. So for the sake of the audience that is here, I would just adjust the volume until things are sort of hitting around the same point, and be sure that up here things aren't peaking, aka turning red. For people who are more advanced, there's so much that you can do in this program. You can like compress things and make things. We're not going to get into it. It just is too complicated for this audience because I don't feel great describing it because it's hard for me to understand sometimes. So yeah, normalizing, just adjust the volume until it sounds good. And as you want to do more, there's so many resources that you can look at, which are in an article I wrote before that came out yesterday. Sorry, it's sort of a cop out.
Another kind of wrapping up, where is this going to be posted? How can people watch this video later?
Yes, so we're going to post the video likely on Acast's YouTube channel as a private link. So it'll be sent out in an email, and yeah, so stay tuned for that. Anything else?
That article will also be sent in that email, I assume. The article that Becky said, that Becky wrote, that she mentioned.
Yeah. So I'll just verbalize some of the really good resources. The NPR Training Center, it's just a website online. It's amazing. And transom.org. I learned everything I know about audio engineering from transom.org. Like, God bless those people, man. They're amazing. So those are my recommendations if you want something now. But stay tuned. I'll send over the article after this. Anything else? Cool. So I just want to say that, if you're interested in starting a podcast, I know we're right at time, so I'll do this really quickly. If you're interested in starting a podcast, Acast is a hosting platform. And for the people who are here today, we do have a free hosting code. It's just code Aclass. So if you go to acast.com and hit sign up and use the code Aclass, you'll get, I think it's 6 months of free hosting. Tess, yell at me if that's not right. And you can kind of poke around and test out your podcast before, say, committing to something longer term. Again, we'll be posting this after. And I just want to thank everybody on the Acast side. So Tess, Ryan, Tiffany, Trace, Sarah, the whole content team. You guys are great. And yeah, I hope this was useful. And you can always shoot me an email. I might be slow on it, but I'll get back to you soon. So that's it, guys.